Hi, I'm Donna Riley. I'm an associate professor in the Picker Engineering program at Smith College in the United States. Smith College is a small private liberal arts college for women, and we are in fact the first women's college in the country to offer an engineering program and to offer an accredited engineering program in the field of engineering science. We offer an engineering science degree because of our size and because we believe in the breadth of a liberal arts education. So students are learning engineering in a way that teaches across the disciplines of engineering as well as drawing on the liberal arts context. At Smith, I teach engineering thermodynamics, which is a required core course for the major. I have in the past taught a first-year, second semester class called Mass and Energy Balances. I've also taught our introduction to engineering called Engineering for Everyone, which is a design-based introduction for both majors and non-majors. I've taught the Capstone Design Clinic class as a project coach, where I coach some of the teams. Someone else is the instructor for that class. And I've been involved in a number of engineering electives. Currently, I rotate 3 electives, one in engineering and global development, one in science, technology, and ethics, and one in risk assessment and risk communication. My background is in chemical engineering, that's my bachelor's degree, and my PhD was an interdisciplinary degree in engineering and public policy. And this reflected my sort of progression of trying to put together engineering and social justice. My interest in social justice actually predated my interest in engineering. When I was in high school, I was involved to a small extent in a number of social justice issues, including opposing U.S. aggression in Central America, working for nuclear disarmament, increasing AIDS awareness, and also working on environmental issues, which I found very compelling, having grown up in Los Angeles, where there's a significant amount of air pollution. And so I founded an environmental club at my high school, and I became very interested in majoring in something having to do with the environment. And environmental studies and environmental science were new fields at that time, and I asked my father for advice on whether it would be a good idea to engage this sort of emerging field. My father at that point suggested engineering, he himself having been an engineer, and I had really not considered it until that point. I was probably 16 or 17 at that time. And so I looked into it, and I thought it might be a great way to prepare myself to work on environmental issues and to make real change. So in college, I pursued a chemical engineering major, and I also pursued a number of activist activities and some academic forms of rounding out my education on the environment by minoring in environmental studies and by taking a number of courses that related to science, technology, and policy. So doing that, one of the things that I noticed was that my activism on the environment on campus really was not a welcome subject in my courses on the environment, that a scientific construction of environmental work did not include, and in fact precluded, any activist work, lest the science appeared to be biased. And similarly, I worked on feminist issues through the Women's Center on my campus. I was working both on women in science issues and on violence against women, which was a major problem on my campus at the time. And I found that a feminist approach to engineering was not welcome, that the Society of Women Engineers and the Women's Center did not mix. These two things were separate. And what separated them, I believe, was the social justice mission of the Women's Center versus a more narrowly defined career advancement approach of the Society of Women Engineers. So when I moved on to graduate school, I chose a program deliberately that was not purely engineering, but that integrated engineering with public policy. However, in this program as well, I found it difficult to integrate my social justice concerns with my disciplinary advancement. And in particular, I was working on risk assessment and risk communication, And by day, in my role as a graduate student, I was working on the chemical consumer product risks. And yet, outside of my graduate degree, I was doing street outreach with injection drug users, doing harm reduction, which was also a form of risk communication. And yet again, these things could not be combined in my graduate program. And so it wasn't until I became a professor that I truly found a way to integrate my social justice concerns with engineering. And that was really through pedagogy, by adopting pedagogies of social justice. And in this case, that would be feminist pedagogies, critical pedagogies, anti-racist pedagogies, post-colonial pedagogies. I was able to find a way to bring social justice concerns into my classroom and integrate them with engineering content. So I'm often asked by people who know that I'm integrating social justice with engineering education. I get asked, why should one do that? And I think that the perception among my engineering colleagues is that I'm bringing in a political perspective into engineering, which is presumed not to have a political perspective. But the reality is that, in fact, engineering does have a particular political perspective, and it is a singular perspective that is not articulated and is therefore never challenged. And so what teaching social justice can do is bring out what the unspoken political assumptions of engineering are and introduce some alternatives to that perspective. Bell Hooks famously said, "No education is politically neutral." And I think that is the reality, that engineering education, through its silences on issues like racism, is teaching students about race. And it's teaching them a particular way of dealing with racism, which is specifically ignoring it. And not taking responsibility for white privilege and not engaging with structures of power that are creating inequality. So what social justice approaches to engineering education might do is highlight this, to show that engineering is teaching things from a particular perspective and to offer some alternative perspectives to that. And I would argue that the overall structure of engineering as a profession in the United States is directed around national priorities, which are set through the federal budget. And because we have been continually increasing our emphasis on military applications, most of the engineering jobs that students have available to them when they graduate are in defense. And the rest of them are largely in corporate America. And a lot of those corporations are defense contractors as well, so it's hard to sort of separate these two things. But it's important to point out how political priorities align with the federal budget and how engineers are then enlisted to do those particular activities. And if they have an interest in some kinds of engineering that are not part of that agenda, then they need to plan very carefully what their careers are going to be like. And it means that they might need to acquire certain skill sets that would enable them to start out on their own, to form a different kind of engineering organization, to raise funds so that they could support different kinds of engineering that they might want to do. And so while on the one hand we in the US are trying to recruit new students to engineering using social justice language, saying that engineering is a humanitarian profession, that engineering can be used to do social good, our students often come in with very idealistic goals, but come out looking at their opportunities, which are very limited. So that's, I think, a key reason to teach social justice and engineering. So I'm going to talk about two ways in which I integrate social justice concerns into my classroom. The first thing I want to talk about is what I do in a core engineering thermodynamics class. And then I will talk about what I do in my elective course on science, technology, and ethics. So in my thermodynamics class, my main strategy is to call attention to the fact that what's decided as content for the thermodynamics class is a choice that someone has made, whether these are textbook publishers or authors that have made this choice, or whether it's me as the instructor writing a syllabus who's made a set of choices. Any course in thermodynamics represents not some absolute reality of what that discipline is or what that course subject area is, but it represents a set of choices someone has made about what belongs in that class. And so what we see in thermodynamics in particular is that it's not, while the course is ostensibly about energy, and you learn, you know, some of the physical laws about energy and then apply them to engineering systems, what you're really learning is a 19th century science around the development of the steam engine and around fossil fuel-based technologies. And while over time examples have been added and some problems have been added to illustrate some renewable technologies, in the end students aren't really learning the fundamental principles they need to know to work on energy in the 21st century. They're learning about only one aspect, one set of technologies. So wind energy, for example, requires knowledge of fluid mechanics, and solar energy requires knowledge of heat transfer. And while sometimes you have thermo classes that are thermal fluids classes, or you have thermo classes that include some heat transfer, rarely are all of these things taught together as a holistic energy systems engineering course. So I call attention to that with my students, and I ask them to understand why that is. That these choices aren't in fact just arbitrary, but these are politically determined, and that what constitutes a body of knowledge reflects a set of political processes. And so they actually read a small excerpt from Michel Foucault from the book Power Knowledge. There is a small section called Truth and Power, and within that he talks about scientific truth in society and how scientific structures of power have become the arbiters of truth in society, and so he explains how power and knowledge are interrelated and how they construct one another. And so the students use that to then critically examine the syllabus, the curriculum in the course, and ultimately the material that they're learning and how it's presented. So later in the course they engage the second law of thermodynamics, and in fact it helps a lot, I think, to have both a historical perspective and a critical perspective on how the second law is presented, because there are multiple statements of the second law, all of which could be said to be true in some sense, but that reflect particular perspectives having to do with the steam engine or having to do with achieving particular goals in science. For example, trying to write the second law in the form of an equation or an inequality, and struggling with the fact that you can't balance entropy. It does not balance. You are always increasing entropy. How you deal with that concept and how difficult it is for students to learn about entropy, because they're coming in with the expectations of scientific knowledge, that things should balance, that things should be elegant, that you should be able to have universal statements and so on. And the second law defies all of these things, so it's an excellent place to teach students about the thematic content of science and how that is politically and socially constructed. So they do that in my thermo class. And at the same time, they're also learning about some of the things that are missing. So having called their attention to what's missing in the class, I supplement the textbook with current topics. In particular, they do an ethics assignment about climate change. And this assignment asks them to look at the international meetings that have been happening for years now over climate change, in which countries in the north and countries in the south are battling over who's responsible for the climate change that we have now, and who's responsible for taking leadership in addressing carbon emissions now. So by engaging all of these things, I think that it's a way of integrating social justice concerns into thermodynamics in a way that is quite relevant. In my science, technology, and ethics class, I have, because it is an elective course, I have a great deal more freedom in terms of how to construct the curriculum. And that course is structured around, the inspiration for that course actually is a quote from Martin Luther King from his speech on April 4th, 1967, in opposition to the Vietnam War, given at Riverside Church in New York City, one of the things that he says is that when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights have become more important than people, then the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, Okay, so the second class that I want to talk about is my course in Science, Technology, and Ethics. And the inspiration for this class came from a quote from Martin Luther King's speech against Vietnam, which he gave in 1967. And the speech says that we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. So it wasn't just this Martin Luther King quote, but as I was meditating on the King quote, I happened across a documentary by Errol Morris called Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, which profiles the lives of four men whose lives are absolutely wrapped up in control, and that contains themes around sexism, racism, and imperialism and consumerism. And so I began to structure the course around some key themes. So it begins with some basics of science and technology studies. They learn about the co-construction of science and society. They learn about some basic approaches to engineering ethics and how science and technology studies might inform engineering ethics and broaden what's commonly thought of as narrow individualistic professional ethics to something that might include a more collective social ethics. So with that introduction, they then pursue three thematic units. The first unit is on technology and control, and they consider the ethics of using technology as a means of control in a variety of different circumstances, including environmental technologies, information technologies, military technologies, and reproductive technologies. And we're drawing on literature across a bunch of different disciplines for this. They read engineering, they read science and technology studies, they read gender studies work, they read work from philosophy, of course, as well. Then the second unit that they encounter is on science and social inequality. And it begins with a deconstruction of the narrative around underrepresentation and a reconstruction of that narrative around social inequality, so that they can come to understand the problems of underrepresentation of both women and minorities in engineering, not as a problem for women or minorities to solve through working harder or assimilating themselves to engineering culture, but actually looking more systemically at racism and sexism as sources of the problem, right? And then, having done that, we then focus on racist projects in science. And this is a unit that rotates in different readings around various historical and some contemporary projects, including the Tuskegee syphilis experiments and the recent discovery of a similar set of experiments that the U.S. conducted in Guatemala. This year we read the book on Henrietta Lacks and the development of HeLa cells and the effect on all of that research on Henrietta Lacks's descendants. We have looked at a case from Smith College on an anthropometry researcher that dug up Native American remains, and the way that the college subsequently handled them and ultimately repatriated them to the tribe of origin. And we've looked at science under the Nazis and also resistance of socialist physicians to the Nazi regime. And following that unit, students take up the issue of consumerism, and we look at it from several angles. There's the angle of planned obsolescence and the sort of rapidity of consumption, and its environmental impacts and its social impacts. And then we look at privatization as a phenomenon and globalization as a phenomenon, and look at consumerism within those contexts. And then finally, there's a unit that looks forward, that seeks to take the critiques that they have read and do some visioning work around how science and technology might be framed in a way that could be more ethical or more socially just. And in this course, social justice is not the only ethical framework that students use, but it is introduced as one perspective that students can use to approach science, technology, and ethics. But by taking up the topics that I have chosen, I think that I have infused the course with a set of questions that are absolutely grounded in social justice. So we've been asked to talk about resistance, what kinds of resistance we've received from students or from our administration or senior colleagues. And I've definitely experienced resistance on all fronts, and I think I will talk first about the students. Student resistance is something that fortunately is theorized in the pedagogies that I used. So critical pedagogies talk about student resistance as part of the what's going on in the classroom. When you try to shift power dynamics, you would expect students to resist that. And I think another really important framing that writers from the critical pedagogy field have done is also to cast the work that employers of the pedagogy are doing as resistance as well. That by using pedagogies of liberation in my classrooms, I am resisting structures of power at my institution and in the field of engineering as well. So there's multiple layers of resistance that need to be unpacked, right? So I am resisting the status quo, and students similarly are resisting my power in the classroom. But what's complicated about this is that this resistance is very positive in the sense that it levels the power dynamic, and their resisting my power is in fact doing that work of leveling the power dynamic in the classroom, which is a goal I'm trying to achieve. At the same time, students sometimes in resisting my power are claiming power of the establishment, of the engineering establishment, right, of the status quo, in order to oppose what I'm doing. So instead of an act of resistance, it's more an act of backlash. And so these complexities are important to understand. So for example, there was an incident in one of my thermodynamics classes a few years ago where I assign a significant amount of writing. Students do learning reflections, and they are asked to, with every problem set, there is a short 1-2 page kind of writing assignment that relates in some way to current energy topics or to engineering ethics and so on. And the student was very frustrated, and she held up a problem set and said, "This is engineering." And then she held up the writing assignment for that week and said, "This isn't engineering." And so she had, what was wonderful about that is that she had gotten to a place where she felt ownership over the canon, if you will, over what belongs in an engineering class. She had come to say that she as a student knows what she should be learning. And that was the most important moment as far as the pedagogies go. That was a really key point. At the same time, we can't ignore the power relations of her reinforcing what she believes the engineering establishment wants her to be learning. So with that, there's sort of multiple layers of resistance going on in that particular story. And what I was able to do with that, it was a wonderful learning moment for everybody in the class because I was able to re-motivate for students. It just so happened that the very next class, this happened at the end of class before Thanksgiving break, the first class after Thanksgiving was a class on cogeneration. And I had already decided to motivate that using the case of our campus trying to decide whether or not to retrofit our physical plant to be a cogeneration facility. So I was able to have this conversation of, well, how would you get our college to decide to do cogeneration? And the students ably said, well, we have to educate the trustees who are not technically trained in what cogeneration is. We have to be able to write a coherent memo, a short and concise memo that explains the technology to a non-expert. And by sort of going through all that, they needed to understand the politics of the campus and the Board of Trustees itself. And so they were sort of remotivating for themselves why some of the other things that I had them doing in the class were, in fact, as important as the technical content. So I found that to be a very productive type of resistance. There are other forms of resistance with the pedagogies that I employ in particular, where students are asked to take more responsibility for their learning. They're asked to do some of the teaching in the class, and that sometimes entails more work or a different kind of work than they're used to. And some of the resistance is inaction, simply not wanting to participate in certain exercises and so on. And that requires a different kind of engagement, of really understanding what the motivation is behind students' inaction. Is it because they're uncomfortable, in which case there are things that one can do to make them more comfortable. And it's about really establishing relationships and understanding the students that one's working with. So the second kind of resistance is the resistance that I experience as an employee, right, from higher level administrators or senior faculty. And this is much more difficult to discuss, but it is real. And I think for me, having come from an interdisciplinary background, I was able to see the resistance to social justice on a continuum with forms of resistance that I've experienced to interdisciplinary work prior to engaging engineering and social justice. So when I was working on chemical consumer products, part of the work I was doing was in the field of psychology, trying to understand human behavior and integrate that with engineering modeling. And to the extent that that was not considered engineering, I received negative feedback from senior colleagues. And similarly, when I began to engage engineering education, I received similar feedback. And I would say that for me, it's been very analogous to activist work that I do. That when you do something that resists power, power responds, and that response is though painful, it's also an indication that what you've done is making some kind of difference. And of course, you have to weigh the cost and weigh what it is that you're doing and what you're willing to do for the particular act of resistance that you're engaging in. But there are strategies for survival as well that are important, and that includes educating people and talking with as many people as possible about the work and finding supportive colleagues. And that's why I think the Engineering, Social Justice, and Peace Network is such a powerful collective, because many of us work in isolation in our universities and do face resistance, but we know that we have a group of folks that understands and that has our backs.